you, we give the week in front of us to you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Over the last few weeks, my kids, well, my daughter in particular, has been in a group project at school. Had a couple of those little group projects. Anybody remember school group projects? 6 of you. The rest of you failed. That makes sense. All right, that's cool. Group projects. I just wanted to share with you, I'm not a huge group project fan. I'm just kidding. I love group projects. I think they're incredible. But the thing I pick up when I talk about group projects with other people, like that nobody likes them, but I thought they were always fun. I want to share with you just from my own participation, my own experience in group projects, some I would say regulars that would be considered like normal characters in a group project. And you could probably identify with one or two of these. The first person that's always in a group project is the control freak. They take control immediately. You haven't even gotten all the instructions. Like the teacher's still trying to give you the specifics, and already they're like, and you're going to be doing this, and if there's this, then you're going to be doing this. Like, hey, you need to chill for a second because I'm just trying to figure out how I just get by, okay? So we need to just settle the instructions down. The control freak's always there. And then once the assignments are actually there, they're following up incessantly. And it's like, we got 3 weeks to do this project. That means I've got 2 weeks and 6 days where I start. So you need to chill. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what's going on here. Second person that's always in a group project is the magician. That's what I like to call them. They're there at the first meeting and then they disappear until the project is done. And then magically they reappear on presentation day, Like they're there, it's like, man, where'd you come from? And they're all dressed. Like if you got to get dressed up for the end of the thing, like they always look great. And so it's like, man, they must have their heart in this. It's like, no, their heart is not, no. I don't know where their heart is, but it was gone too. Third one is the bare minimum guy. This is the one that tries extremely hard to figure out what's the least I can do and still get credit, To put it in adult terms, this is the person that is bringing paper plates and ice to your Super Bowl party tonight. That's exactly it. They're the first people to sign up, though, aren't they? Like you send out a group text like, hey, what can I bring? And then someone's like, oh, I'll get paper plates and ice. And it's like, okay, great. Bring a $50 bill attached to that bag of ice, okay? Okay, thank you for your paper plates and your ice. Now, if you forget ice, the person who gets ice on the way, when you forgot it, they're a lifesaver. But they're bringing ice and something else. And so I'm just letting you know, everybody's thinking it. If you're the ice guy tonight, step up your game. You know what I'm saying? Or put a Benjamin on the ice and bring it in, a little melty. It's fine. Anyway, that's part of group projects. Next one is the idea guy, idea girl. This one talks a lot, has a ton of ideas, but no desire to do anything to make them happen because they see the idea as the most valuable contribution you can have. That's me, by the way. I've got a lot of ideas, and it's like, look, we could do this. And it's like, all right, well, this is what it's going to take to do that. It's like, we need to find some people who love to do that, who love to do things. I just like to come up with things. And then we got the overachiever who does their part so well it makes everyone else look bad. You know what I'm talking about. Some of you are that person. Some of you are that person. Like every single time. Like, I put my heart in something. I show up. And the thing is, maybe it comes across as sexist. Here's the truth. Every overachiever I ever met in a group project's a girl. Every single one of them. I show up and it's like, man, I put my heart into this and I put it next to hers. And it's like, good gracious alive. I didn't even try. It was like I did nothing. Group projects. Truth is, if you live in a community, your whole life's a group project. But your disdain for group projects in school is probably similar to the disdain you have for group projects in community. Same characters exist. Same heartache and frustration exists. So I want to share with you today just a piece of a really big group project. I want to walk you through a pretty old story out of the Bible. Now, what's interesting about this story in particular is that the timeline and the significant events are attested to in multiple places outside of the Bible. I mean, if we look through Persian records, for instance, no connection to the biblical narrative at all. There's moments that take place that align with our timeline, historical events that take place. If you look through Babylonian history and documents, there are moments and there's events that take place in Babylonian history that align with the biblical event. If you look through Greek histories and through Greek historians, they talk about the exact same events that we're going to talk about. It begins in 586 BC. The people of God at that point had been divided into two very distinct kingdoms. If you're not someone who follows the Bible or who knows the Old Testament story, the people of God were given a land that they referred to as the Promised Land. And for a while, they had it. They inhabited it. There were 12 tribes or 12 really large families that kind of made up that, and they had grown into over 100,000 each. There was over 2.5 million people who would be considered followers of God or Jewish people at one point, and they inhabited this entire place called the Promised Land. Now, the covenant they made with God, or the promise they made with God, is that as long as they continued to worship God as God, as primary, like, hey, you're our guy, that they could have the land. However, if they decided to deviate from that, then they would be breaking their promise. And so in 586, one of the kingdoms, the kingdom on the southern end called Judah, fell to another army. In fact, another nation. It was the Babylonians. Now, when we get to 586, we're picking up there, just as an aside, the northern kingdom had fallen some decades before then to a completely different kingdom. I believe it was Persia. And so there's only the southern kingdom left. It's called Judah. And Judah falls to Babylon in 586. You know him maybe as a different Bible story or Sunday school story if you grew up in church, as the king with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he brings his army. He takes over the entire kingdom of Judah. And then with that, he starts to exile the people from the kingdom of Judah back to Babylon. This happens over a number of decades. There's 3 different waves of people that end up getting exiled. The people of God saw this exile as divine judgment. They said, hey, we broke our promise to God. We started worshiping other religions and idols, and we brought all these things in, and now we are suffering the consequence. Our land belongs to another nation, and our people have all been taken to this other nation to serve. Now, that lasted until 539 BC when King Cyrus the Great led a conquest of Babylon. Now, they weren't there to get the Jewish people. It just happened that the Jewish people were in Babylon because they had been exiled. And so that's what happens. All of a sudden, King Cyrus shows up. He's like, hey, we are here to take Babylon. Where all these people come from? Like, oh, these are people that Nebuchadnezzar took over decades before. And so he's got this huge group of people. And he makes a decision about a year later, in 538, he says, hey, y'all can go home. Like, if you want to go back home, you're welcome to go home. Which is huge. It was like, okay, all right. We can go back to Jerusalem, back to Judah. Yeah, you can go home. If y'all want, you can stay here or you can go home. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people went. I think if I'm remembering correctly, about 40,000 people went the first wave back. But when they went back, they were going back to a city that didn't exist. Like no one rebuilt the city. It wasn't like once they left, someone came in and moved into that area and made it nice again. They were going back to a city with walls that had been destroyed because of the Babylonian conquest previously. They were walking back into a city that was still in ruins. No one had done anything. But that was the decision they had to make, which is why so few go back the first time. The first wave, as they do go back in 538, was led by a guy named Zerubbabel. And his whole idea was like, I know we're going back to a ruined city, but we are going to go back and we're going to restore a little bit of the Jewish identity, which was the temple. The temple was destroyed in 586. And so he said, we're going to rebuild it. So Zerubbabel, he goes back and he leads this crew to rebuild the temple, thinking that, hey, this is going to be like the symbol of who we are. Let's rebuild it. Let's get some Jewish identity back into the land of Judah, into Israel, into Jerusalem. The second wave comes a little bit after, led by a guy named Ezra. Now, Ezra didn't go to build anything, but he went back and led a crew back to make some social change happen. He realized that there was a symbol of the people of God in the temple, but they weren't actually acting like the people of God. And so he went back and led this crew back to say, hey, spiritually and interpersonally, we need to make some adjustments. We've got a symbol, a physical building that says we're God's people, but we're not acting like God's people. And you fast forward another 15 years or so, and we get to what we're talking about today, the third wave of exiles returning to Jerusalem. This was led by a guy named Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, a foreign king, still in the exile. He had gotten a position, worked his way up, was trusted in this particular kingdom and was the guy, if you haven't watched like a bunch of knight in shining armor movies, the cupbearer is the guy that like drinks the wine or tries the food before the king does. That way if somebody's trying to poison the king, then the person who's the cupbearer will get poisoned and they will die. Now, I don't know what happens if you're trying to poison the cupbearer. I guess you're successful. That's what would happen because that's the risk that comes with the job. But with that, you get to be in the king's court. You get to eat some really great food, drink some good wine, like the whole thing. Like it's a positive experience. And this entire time, Nehemiah has had the option to go home. He's had it. He could go anytime he wanted to. He didn't have to take a cupbearer job. He didn't have to apply for the royal court. He didn't have to do any of those things. He has been of his own volition to say, hey, you can stay or you can go back home. But this entire time has not been on his radar to go back home. All of a sudden, though, his brother, or one of his brothers, has visited Jerusalem, comes back to see Nehemiah, and Nehemiah just asks him, he's like, hey, so how's Jerusalem? Like, tell me about it. And his brother says, bro, it's a mess. I mean, what do you mean, how's Jerusalem? It's a mess. I mean, there's no walls. There's not even like a footprint of where a city belongs. It's a mess. The gates from over 100 years ago that were burned, they're still like sitting there on the ground. It's a mess. Like there's people, but there's no nation. There's no city. And Nehemiah hears this, and he's grieved. It says it takes him into this state of just like his stomach is churning, his heart's beating fast. It's like, what is this? And I'm sure that there's probably something at play that just says, I mean, look at the life that I live and my home, my people. Like they don't even have walls to say, hey, this is a city, this is promised land. They don't have anything. In fact, they walk around in rubble. And so he begins to ask God, what can I do? Show me, what can I do? We fast forward a number of weeks, and he's in the king's presence. And the king notices that he's a little down. And so he asks him, he said, hey, you're never like upset. Like, what's going on? There's got to be something happening, behind the scenes. Like, what's up? And so he tells him, in fact, he asks the question. He's like, why shouldn't I be upset? Which is a risk, right? It's a risk. You're about to unload your personal drama on the king. You know what I'm saying? Which I get, the king kind of asked, but I mean, still, the king's asking, but is he really asking? Does he really want to know? He was just like, oh, yeah, I got some gas, king. You know what I'm saying? It's maybe uncomfortable. I'm fine. I'm going to touch your stuff. That's probably what he's looking for. That's what he's thinking. And so he's like, well, why shouldn't I be upset? The place where my ancestors are buried lies in rubble. It's been over a century. He's like, my home is destroyed. And we've got people. I've got extended family living there in ruins. And look where I am. And so the king looks at him and says, well, what do you want to do? And so he says, well, I want to go. I want to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He says, well, how long is that going to take? And the Bible doesn't tell us in that particular, it doesn't tell us what they say, but Nehemiah gives him some answer. And so the king and the queen, they're sitting there, and they respond to Nehemiah and say, okay, you can go for that long. Is there anything else you need? He was like, well, actually, now we're talking about it, I got to go through some other people's land to get there, so it'd be great if you would like write me a letter that said, hey, I'm okay with you doing this. And he was like, okay, I'll write the letters. So he wrote the letters. And then he says, is there anything else? He was like, well, rumor has it takes some materials to rebuild walls and gates. Any chance I could borrow some timber from what we got here in this fantastic little nation? And he says, yeah, in fact, you can get it from like the royal forest. You're welcome. Here's a letter saying get all you need. And so, and then beyond that, the king says, hey, I'm going to give you a cavalry, like a military guard. Like they're going to go with you. And so they set out. He's got letters in hand. I don't know how many scrolls this guy's carrying. He's got letters to governors and letters for wood. And he's walking through and boom, off they go. Now, when he gets to Jerusalem, though, he didn't tell anybody why he's there. He pulls up. He didn't pull up. He walks up, rides up, whatever he does, whatever you do on a horse, gallop up. He gallops up. He waits until the sun goes down, and he decides, I'm going to go inspect the walls and just see what kind of like big like job this really is. And so he waits till night. He takes just a couple people with him, and he goes around he's trying to go around the entirety of the wall. There's places where the rubble has spread out so much he can't even take his horse up beside it. And so he's got to go way down on the other side just to be able to get a glimpse of how much the destruction and damage is taking place. And so he takes a circle as far as he can go anyway, and then he comes up with a plan, and then he gathers the leaders together. Sun comes up. He gathers the leaders together and says, hey, here's the deal. I've taken a look at the walls. I got scrolls. They say I can do this. And I don't know if y'all noticed, I got some big old sticks that I brought with me. Big ones. We're going to rebuild the walls and the gates. And all the people are like, let's go. The king's in on this? The king is in on this. We can rebuild our walls. We can rebuild our walls. You're here to do it. I'm cupbearer to the king. Come on, you know what that means? You know? So they set out to do it. Now, it would be great if the story just ended there. Like, man, I feel sad. My people, can I ask? Can I get some timber? Can I get some letters? Yes. Rally the people. Build the walls, right? If the story ended there, that'd be great. The story doesn't end there. And the reason it doesn't end there is because there's people involved in the story, and people always have issues. People ruin everything. First set of people that ruin everything are people from the outside. People from the outside. In particular, there's two guys, Sanballat and Tobiah. They were governors of cities really close to Jerusalem. Now, they weren't in Jerusalem. They were super close, and so they were governors, had a lot of authority, and when Nehemiah shows up and says, hey, we're about to do this work, they're not happy at all. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 10, it says this, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much, listen to this is wild, you're not even going to believe me. I didn't put it on the screen because it's my fault. I got this one to Christian late, and I actually didn't tell him. I made the edit this morning. So sorry you can't read it. I'm reading it to you. If you want to look in your own Bible if you want to. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard this, they were very much disturbed. Here's the crazy part. That someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. That's what disturbed them. Not that there was possibly going to be a wall. None of those. That's what disturbed them. It disturbed them that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites, which gives us an incredible window into how they were being abused by the outside people for an enormous amount of time. For over a century, people had taken advantage of everything Jerusalem had to offer because they couldn't keep anybody out. They couldn't keep anybody that wanted bad for them, they couldn't do anything about it. And so it disturbs them that someone would come and speak up for the Jewish people. Wow. And so, two strategies to undo this. Strategy one was just simple words. Ridicule, mockery. And in fact, one of the governors goes so far, and it makes me feel like this has been a tactic they've used before. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but the way they start and what they say just makes me feel like, hey, this has worked in the past to derail what the Jewish people have wanted to do, so maybe it'll work again. He begins to call them names. He uses the word feeble. And if you're not familiar with feeble, I don't think it's a word we use all that often. Feeble means frail, miserable, powerless, withered, weak. He reminds them of who they are. This other governor, he's like, oh, okay, Jewish people. You want to rebuild your walls and gates. Let me remind you, you're a bunch of weak, miserable people. And you want to rebuild your walls and your gates? No. That's who you are. You're not builders. You're not people that can protect yourself. You're feeble people. He goes on from there, and instead of attacking just maybe who they are, he talks about their religion. He says, oh, what are you going to do? You're going to go up in that temple of yours and make a sacrifice to God, and you think he's then going to be able to make you all of a sudden into wall builders? He talks about the materials they used. While Nehemiah did bring timber from the royal forest, you don't build walls out of wood. That's a gate, right, or a fence. You weren't building a fence. They were building a wall, like an enormous wall. Like at the end of when it's all said and done, scholars say somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 miles of wall. In some places, 20 foot wide, right? Over 15 foot high. This is a huge wall. And you're not building that with timbers. And so what they were planning on using was the stones that were there to build the wall the first time. And so they said, hey, look, when this city was wrecked, those stones were demolished. They're in small pieces. And the ones that aren't in small pieces have all been through an enormous fire. They're weak. That's the material you're going to use to rebuild this incredible wall that all of a sudden is going to give you some protection from these other enemies around you? This was Nehemiah's response in chapter 4, verse 4 and 6. Hear us, our God, he's praying, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. Now, notice two things happen. He prays and then he acts. Now, the prayer is not a nice prayer, by the way. It's not forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. Jesus is not here yet. They are just, in fact, his prayer is, hey, if there's any way, Sanballat and Tobiah and that crew, if you could put them in captivity, that'd be great. That's what I'm praying. That's what he's praying for. Like, do not forget these people, God. Just reminding you, I know you say you see it, but I'm reminding you, they have insulted your builders. That's what he says to them. But then, beyond that, he closes it with verse 6. He prays and he says, so we rebuilt the wall to half its height. In other words, there was prayer and action, which is a really important combination, especially if you call yourself a Christian, because there's so many Christians in our world that has convinced themselves their only responsibility is to pray. That's not true. No, we pray to prepare ourselves oftentimes, not for a miracle that God's going to do, but an opportunity that we're going to step into that God provides. We want God to do something, and God is saying, I just want to make a way for you to do something. We're asking God, snap your fingers and change this thing. And he's just like, no, I've wired you to take on this problem. The reason you're so tore up about it is because I've been preparing your heart to be in angst over this issue. My miracle is you. I'm sending you. Because the truth is, while you've been praying for this to happen, there have been people praying already in Jerusalem for over 100 years. And the crew that's showing up is the answer to a 100-year prayer. Not just a prayer to put on top of the 100-year prayer. No, it's the answer to the prayer is you. That's what Nehemiah takes on. When the words don't work, they go to the next strategy. They escalate a little bit. They go to violence. And so word gets out. They just tell them, hey, watch your backs. You might be putting together this wall, but I want to let you know when you're least expecting it, we're coming for you. Right? And so Nehemiah has a decision to make. He's like, look, good gracious, it's hard enough to rebuild 1.7, 2.5 mile round wall. Like, it's hard enough to do that. But now I got to figure out how do I equip an army? Like, these aren't even people. Like, there's no army here. There's no nation of Israel. Like, none of that's happening. There are no walls. There's no standing army. Like, what are we doing? But Nehemiah has a response. This is what he says. He says, from that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. So they're carrying some rocks, holding the sword. You know what I'm saying? Like one hand, I'm ready to fight. The other one, I'm just carrying this brick over here, putting this little hole next to the fish gate. Like, that's what's happening. And that's what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah said, I don't have a great answer. I don't got an army coming with me to figure this whole thing out. This is what we got to do. If we're going to complete the project, if we're going to take on the issue in front of us, we're going to have to figure it out. When that doesn't work and they realize that the people of God, the builders, have armed themselves, and that's not going to work, they then try a different strategy, a little diplomacy undercover. They send some letters to Nehemiah asking him, saying, hey, we see this is happening. Obviously, this is causing some concern. We would like to meet with you to talk about this. And invites him to leave the city and come to another place to meet. And so Nehemiah sees straight through it. He's like, man, I ain't having coffee with you, Joker. No, there's no chance. I ain't going somewhere else without my people around. I know what you're going to do. You're not going to let me walk out of that coffee tent alive. Now, 4 times they try this. 4 times they send letters. Nehemiah responds. All 4 times and says, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm really busy. I got a wall to build. And so I don't have time to do the coffee thing. That's what he says. They don't use coffee, but I don't have time to meet with you. The 5th time, they change strategies again. They send the same invitation, but this time, instead of it being sealed, as when your government officials send something, back and forth, there's a wax seal so that nobody can open it. And if you open it, you can't reclose it, right? It's a done deal. So it would be sealed when you sent something official to someone. This time, they send it unsealed. The first 4 had seals on them. This last one doesn't. And in this last one, the reason they leave it unsealed is because they put some rumors in it. They say, we've heard that you actually want to be king. And as soon as the walls are done, you're going to rebel and try to overthrow the king that you came from. Now, the reason they put that in there is because they want the guy who's carrying it to be like, oh, this ain't sealed. Let me see what's going on. Let me get my business out. And so he reads it, and the rumor starts spreading. And so Nehemiah just makes this public announcement. He says, look, that's not true. They're making it up. I'm here just to rebuild the walls. If that wasn't enough, there's not just enemies from the outside. There was enemies on the inside. You see, there was a famine. And during the famine, people who had farms were struggling. There's still taxes due. There's still other loan payments that are loans that have been secured. Those payments were due. And so there were some wealthy individuals that were Jewish people that lived in the confines of the city. And so they took it upon themselves to help their neighbors out. And so they would then loan them money to pay the taxes or whatever financial obligations they had. Except when they made the loan, they put such an enormous interest rate on it that they knew there was no chance they were paying it back. And if they did, they were coming out with a huge upside. And so not only did the people not pay it back, when they didn't pay it back, guess what? You had collateral. What was the collateral? Their possessions, their land, their houses. So all of a sudden, the wealthiest people that were among the Jewish people made loans with enormous amounts of interest, knowing their neighbors couldn't pay it back, just so that they could then acquire their property, and they still owed them money. So when the collateral was taken, and they still owed interest beyond that, whatever it was, if you don't have property to give, what's next? Their children. So then they took their neighbors' children into slavery to pay the debt that the parents made in the middle of a famine. And Nehemiah's listening to this. He's like, what are you doing? You have enslaved your own neighbor's kids to pay a debt so that they could just survive? That's where we're at. By the way, are we the people of God or are we not the people of God? Clarify that for me. What are we doing? Why would you make a loan to your best friend knowing they couldn't repay it, knowing that the collateral was going to be everything he owned, including his children? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Nehemiah calls them all together. And when you're reading through this, it could go either way, right? I mean, it's like, what are they going to say? How dare you? We took advantage of an opportune time. It's not our fault that we didn't prepare, whatever those things are. And so he brings them together and it's like, look, here's the deal. If we're the people of God, you got to return that stuff. You got to release those children. We cannot do this. And they do. All of them. All of them are called to an identity that they had lost. And for their own sake. But honestly, for our sake, for the people of God's sake, they took that correction and said, yeah, we'll make this right. And they did. I would imagine the amount of pride in that conversation as Nehemiah is saying, hey, this is not how we live, had to be through the roof. Very independent people. It is so hard for us to hear God has a different expectation for our life than maybe the expectation we want. The truth is, they had the right to respond however they wanted to. But there was only one that actually took them closer to being a little bit more like Jesus. And they did. I would love for you to read the story. It's in the book of Nehemiah. It's in the Old Testament. So if you're new to Bible study, there's 2 distinct halves of the Bible, or parts of the Bible. The first part establishes the people of God and really tells us why we need Jesus. The second piece is called the New Testament. It talks about the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus and the result of both the life and teachings of Jesus. This is in the Old Testament, establishing why we would need Jesus. And if you look at it, it's really like the first 6, 7 chapters that you can go and read through in the book of Nehemiah. As you read that, though, you're going to get to chapter 3, and you're going to have, after about probably 25 seconds in chapter 3, you're going to be tempted to scan down and see where chapter 3 stops all this craziness with a million names and groups of people. And like, okay, I get it. There's lots of people. And you're going to turn to where the story picks up again. But I would encourage you to spend a few moments in chapter 3, if anything, just because there's some family names in there that the only reason they've been recorded in the Bible and now have survived 2,500 years is because they were faithful to God. And I think it would be nice for you to read their names. Let me give you a few occupations listed in chapter 3 that help build the wall. High priests, Levites, goldsmiths, homeowners, perfumers, politicians, district governors, officials, merchants, temple servants, gatekeepers. Those are all the occupations listed that help build the walls around Jerusalem. Did you notice that not a single one of them were wall builders? Like there's a perfumer, someone who makes perfume. Like that's what they do. Like just like sniffing flowers and things, putting stuff together. Like that's all they do. Like their nose is their most important thing. And they're like, hey, let's go breathe dust for a little while. Let's build this wall. They were homeowners. That's the way they were listed in Scripture. It says their house was like right next to the wall. It doesn't give their profession. I don't know if that means that they were a little older and they probably didn't have a profession. We don't know. That's the way they're described. Their house was close to the wall, and so they hopped in to help. Goldsmiths, just jewelry makers. Merchants, people that like sold fruit and meat and linen. Gatekeepers, like the people that stand at the gate. Not build the gates, they just stand there and they make sure like it opens and closes. None of them wall builders. Built somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 miles of wall, over 20 foot in width in some places. We know this because there's a ceremony that takes place at the end of the story where they dedicate the wall, and there's groups of people standing on top of the wall. That's how wide it was for them to have this dedication ceremony. It's enormous. There was over 40 specific groups mentioned in the people that came together to build the wall. Doesn't give us a final number. The specifics are those groups and those occupations that were listed. And that's it. That's all they give us. None of them wall builders. And when I read that, it reminds me of a very common truth. You see, expertise isn't required to do the will of God. Only willingness is. Just a willingness. Like you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be able to connect dot 1 to dot 2 to dot 3. You might be on dot 1 hoping to get to dot 5 and everything is cloudy in between. But at the end of the day, it's not about expertise to get from 1 to 2. It's just about I'm willing to go. I'm willing. Take my perfume nose and my probably very light little hands and build a wall. In other words, a village of the willing is powerful. You know, one specific that I'm incredibly grateful for is the way Nehemiah begins to close out this moment. He reminds us of all those people, chapter 3. 10 or 11 different occupations that help, the 40 different groups. We know from his history that it's, 1.5 miles to 2.5 miles linear foot, 20 foot in some places, large enough for an entire ceremony to take place on top of it with people standing back and forth. And you begin to wonder, Goodness, Nehemiah, how long does this take? How long does something like that take? I mean, goodness, I've been trying to get the pothole field crossing over 29 by the little giant up here for like a year and a half, you know? They did fill it, by the way. It's great, super smooth. Nehemiah 6:15 says, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. 52 days. That's like February and March plus a day. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not a lot. Okay, plus 3 days. 52 days. Mile and a half, 2.5 miles, linear foot, 15 or so foot tall, 20 foot wide in places. 52 days. Not with wall builders, with perfume guys and goldsmiths and politicians. Politicians. You kidding me? 52 days to do anything? No, Elon Musk was not in this story, okay? I know that's what y'all are thinking. It's just wild. It's wild. You know, the truth is, we get to ask questions like, hey, why do we get some of these stories? Like, why does God allow some of these stories to be involved in the biblical narrative? Like, how does it help us? You know, what are we learning from it? I think it's this. A good village builds people. You see, Nehemiah isn't just about building walls. It's about building people. The entire story shows how ordinary people from all walks of life stepped up to do something extraordinary together. You know, when we look at our community, there's a number of things that I would say feel a little impossible for us. Just really big things. And the truth is, unless we do something about it together, the chances of us making some real dents in some of these problems, pushing back on some of these problems, man, it feels a little more impossible than possible. But together, man, we can make an enormous difference. Our strategy here at Foundation is not to ignore all of the problems. We don't want to be 1,000,000 miles wide and only half an inch deep. And so I get it. Our community has lots of problems. But we try and invest in 3 in particular. One of them's food insecurity, right? Another one is addiction, recovery, whole life restoration, Coweta Forest, food insecurities over Bridging the Gap. And then we try to make sure that anyone that has an unexpected or an unwanted pregnancy understands that there are so many options, resources, care, and love that they never imagined and didn't even know existed with Coweta Pregnancy Resource Center. And we just try to, like those 3 things, and when we think through, hey, how are we going to invest in places? Yeah, we could invest in a lot of places, but one of our rules for community engagement is we want to have high impact. That's rule number 2. Rule number 1 is consistency, rule number 1 is high impact. Rule number 2 is consistency. So if we're going to do something, man, we want to jump all in. That's why we do mentoring with the public school. We have a volunteer in the public school system every single day of the school year. Consistency is key. Every day. So when we think through monetarily, okay, how are we going to jump in? Like $10,000 is like that's where we begin. Like if we're going to invest in something, I don't want to send somebody a check for $50 and say, hey, go change the world, kid. No, we want to take a look and say, hey, we're going to take part of what people give week in and week out, and we're going to set significant chunks aside because we're going to invest in people that are doing huge work, and then we're going to send people. We're going to send funds that we've collected. We're going to send people that gather here on Sundays, and we're going to make a difference. Not just feel better about ourselves because we volunteer a little bit, but we're actually going to see obstacles. We're going to say, look, we need to get rid of these. These things are no good for us. And so together, we can do impossible good. And I really believe that. You know, so many times one of the greatest strategies the enemy has for us is convincing you that your little part doesn't add up to much. It's a lie. It's a lie. And it can be true if you stay by yourself. Like, you can see a version of how that becomes true. The truth is, you go and stand shoulder to shoulder next to 850 other people, and all of a sudden that little becomes a lot. As I mentioned earlier, there's 212 kids here today under the age of 10. Man, 212 opportunities to prepare them to just follow in our footsteps. But what footsteps are we leaving? Are our footsteps scattered all over the place in a million different directions, or are they focused? Do they create a path that our kids can follow? Are they walking in a place that says, hey, my parents went before me and they made some good work, and I'm going to see it through to the finish line if they couldn't? I think any good work will present itself as impossible at the beginning. And I think the first step is that we ought to pray about it. And then we ought to recognize that the promise of God is that the Holy Spirit, the very Spirit of God that resurrected Jesus from the dead, would live inside of those who would follow his son Jesus. And so when we pray to God, oftentimes he gently reminds us, I'm with you. So go. Go take on the impossible good. But do it together. Don't go by yourself. One of you might have to initiate it. One of you might have to get permission from the king. One of you might have to ask the questions to figure out how to supply the lumber. But the truth is, Nehemiah could not build the wall by himself, even with letters and even with sticks. He had to have people. Together, we can do the impossible good. And it's my hope that as we prepare for the next 2 weeks of our Village Mentality series, that this is the foundation of that. Our Village Mentality here at Foundation is together, we can do impossible